Welcome to this video about attacking targets in the steps method. In the steps method there are three different targets identified: material, a check on the king, and the mating square. And we're going to do it by looking at a double attack. And in general, if you talk about a double attack, there are one, two or more attackers attacking two targets. But in the examples that we will be examining today, it is one piece attacking two targets. And another term that's being used in the step method is a twofold attack, where two attackers are attacking one target. So let's get started. So to identify target, right, you look at pieces that are undefended, or for instance, one time defended and one time under attack. And in this case we see three undefended pieces. And now we have to find a way to attack two of the three successfully without there being a defense. And you can do it by drawing lines. And so let me explain that. So for instance, if I see this bishop and I draw a line, and I see this rook and I draw a line, and I see where they intersect, the point of intersection when you draw the lines, diagonals and straight lines, is a point where a double attack occurs. So Queen e1 would be a double attack here, but we also have an undefended rook on b7 and a bishop on e6. So the question is, if we would draw the lines again, right, and see where they intersect, is Queen c6 also a double attack? So very important in chess is that when you find a move for yourself, that you verify and think about what your opponent can do. And later on, when we will examine defending against a double attack, the first thing you look at is, can one of the targets defend the other target? And if you apply that to this situation, after Queen c6, the target, the rook on b7, can go to e7 and defend the other target. Now if we go back and say, how about Queen e1? And now we see that it's impossible for the rook on h4 to defend the bishop on e6 successfully, or for the bishop to defend the rook. So again, we have here two undefended pieces. The black king is relatively safe. We don't have any checks on the black king. And what are the two ways that we can attack the black knight and bishop? By playing Queen e5 or Queen d5. And besides checking whether one target can defend the other piece, the second thing to check is, are there any forcing moves by which black can defend themselves? And we see that after Queen d5, black has the move knight g3, and thereby saving the knight with a forcing move. So we saw sometimes one target can defend the other target, and sometimes there are forcing moves in the position that can save you against an attack. So in this case, Queen e5 is a double attack on the knight and the bishop, and white gains material. So we've seen two examples of material plus material. In this case, right, we see an undefended knight on c4, an exposed king on f6, and this is an example of king plus material. There are two checks that attack the knight. One is correct and the other one is not. And so can you apply the rule for looking when you look for a defense if one of the targets can defend the other? And then you see that queen c3 is incorrect because one of the targets, the knight, can interpose and defend the king, and queen h4 is the right way to attack. And this is an example of king plus material. In this case, we have three targets: the king in the open, the rook on e2, and the bishop on a3. And again, we have to think, how are we going to attack two targets and make sure that there is no defense? So after queen d3, can one of the targets, the rook on e2 or the bishop on a3, defend the other target? And that's the case, rook e3. So that's an incorrect double attack. And so what we have to do is not material plus material, but material plus king. Play queen h3, and after king g1, we capture the bishop on a3. So let's have a look here. Sometimes it's necessary for pieces to cooperate in the attack. And we see here that the bishop on e5 is already attacking the bishop on f6. It's one time defended, one time under attack. So just like with an undefended piece, the power balance is 0. One attacker, one defender, 1 minus 1 is 0. The king is a target, the bishop on f6 is a target, and through the cooperation of the pieces, we can have a double attack by playing the move queen d4, and on the next move the bishop on e5 will capture the bishop on f6, and we are gaining material by the cooperation of the pieces. So now we get to square, the mating square. And a very useful rule of thumb, or a trick you could say, is to make two moves with the same color and find a mate. And if you could do two moves here with white, you would say, oh, actually, if I can play queen h1, queen h7, that would be checkmate. So you can often find a mating square by making two moves with the same color. In this case, of course, the rook is also undefended, so everything comes together, and after queen h1 we have a double attack, attacking the mating square h7 and the undefended rook on b7. So this is more complicated. Again, we need cooperation between the pieces. But ask yourself the question, because it's not an easy exercise, if you can make two moves with white, can you find a mate? And if you approach this position like that, many players will be able to find, if I move the queen to the e file and play knight d6, I have a kind of a smothered mate. And then they see the undefended bishop on c2, and they see that queen to the e file followed by knight d6, two moves with the same color, is mate, and then through the cooperation of the pieces we have a double attack. We are threatening knight d6 checkmate, and we are threatening queen takes c2. So in this case you see that there are two attackers, the knight on c4 and the queen on e2. So in case of a double attack in the steps method, you can have more than one attacker attacking two targets. Let's have a look here. Again, we need cooperation between the pieces. We see that there is an undefended bishop on c7, and through the cooperation of the pieces we can play the move queen e7. And what are we threatening? We are threatening mate on e1 and queen takes c7. So cooperation is very important for the total force of an army and also for the activity of the pieces to begin with. I was explaining before the concept of a twofold attack and about vulnerability in pieces and the power balance. So when we look at the knight on c6, we have one defender, the queen on d7, and one attacker, the bishop on f3. So the power balance is 1 minus 1 is 0. And because of that, we can set up a double attack by connecting the lines, right? Like we said before, if you would draw lines and you see where they intersect, you find the double attack. And queen c2 is a double attack. It's a twofold attack, two attackers on one target, which is the knight on c6, and it's a double attack on the target, the king, a check, and the knight on c6. Please note, right, I'm saying that the power balance on the knight is 0, but if there would be a pawn on b7 instead of a queen on d7, it would be less spectacular because you would win a pawn and not a full piece. So it is important when you have a twofold attack and setting that up, that you think about which piece is defending the other piece. Another example, right? So if you look to the rook on a3, the rook on a1 is attacking the rook on a3, the queen is defending it, so we have a power balance on the rook on a3 of 0, one attacker, one defender. And now let's do our trick and say two moves with the same color and mate for white. And some players might have difficulty finding that, and then you can go to the following rule. You say, let's pick up the queen and just say, I'm allowed to place it anywhere on the board, but it has to be mate. And then players will find very easily that queen f8 is checkmate. And then they say, okay, I found a target, but I did not figure out the route to that square yet. But the target is there, and now we're going to look for the route that attacks the rook on a3 and the square on f8. And then the move queen b4 is easily found. So this is the last example. So far we did only double attacks, but of course this concept of making two moves with the same color to find a mating square also works in different situations. So in this situation, what would you play with black? And again, for many players this would be difficult, right? But if I would ask you, pick up the queen and put it anywhere on the board, and it has to be mate, then they would come up with g1 and h1, and they would say, those are two targets that I have, and let me figure out the route to one of those targets later. Please see that queen f3, right, is not possible because of the bishop on c6. That square has been defended. So can you find a way to get to h1? And then the move, which for many players is difficult to find, which is queen h8, becomes relatively easy. And note that if white were to defend with a move like f3, queen h1 is still checkmate because the bishop on b6 is covering the square f2. So this is my introduction to attacking targets. There are three: material, king, a check on the king, and a mating square. If you want to find the mating square, often you can do two moves with the same color and find a mate. Sometimes it's very difficult to see it immediately. Then we have a subsequent trick by picking up a piece, figuring out what the target square is of that piece, and then after that figuring out the route towards that square. Thank you for watching.